Hello and welcome to today's event, Better Tech for Smarter Transportation, Harnessing the Power of Cloud. My name is Bob Woolley. I'm the Senior Fellow with the Center for Digital Government and formerly the Chief Technical Architect for the state of Utah. I'm really pleased to serve as moderator for today's event and just want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next 60 minutes. Before we begin, a couple of brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass along to colleagues. This webcast is designed to be interactive and you can participate in Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box on the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send in your questions as they come up through the presentation. Our speakers will address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the close of the webinar today. If you'd like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also, during today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Use the hashtag GovTechLive to connect with your peers across the government technology platform on Twitter. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd like to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar, or would like to complete the survey as much as you're able, please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. At this time, we recommend that you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you're experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the Help button at the bottom of the console. Joining me today to discuss this very timely topic are Doug Kudo, Senior Fellow with the Center for Digital Government and former CEO of the Michigan Department of Transportation, Daniel Rhodes, Cloud Data Architect, Lead for CloudReach, and Monali Shah, Strategic Business Executive in the public sector with Google Cloud. Doug Kudo has more than 35 years in public sector executive leadership roles that includes the U.S. Air Force, the state of Iowa, and the state of Michigan. When he moved to the private sector, Citrix and Dell, he continued working with state and local governments and education to maximize the benefits of technologies such as virtual desktops, mobility solutions, and cloud computing. Monali is a strategic business executive for the public sector at Google. In this role, she drives the creation of smart cities, sustainability, and mobility solutions, leveraging Google's cloud AI capabilities to address the needs of public sector agencies. Ms. Shah previously served as the Director of Intelligent Transportation at HERE Technologies and led transportation agencies in the areas of smart cities, connected and automated driving, and traffic management. She serves as an advisor to transportation commissioners. She serves on the board of directors for ITS America and DOE's Smart Mobility Executive Advisory. Ms. Shah has a degree in civil environmental engineering from the University of Michigan and holds an MBA from the University of Chicago. Daniel is a senior cloud data architect and lead at CloudReach. He's been a Google Cloud advisor on serverless architecture for over 7 years. For the past 3 years, Daniel has worked closely with the public sector customers on data and analytics projects that require highly scalable and secure solutions. He was instrumental in the lead and design of the Pronghorn data processing system, the real-time data hub, and the advanced data analytics platform for a state's Department of Transportation. Now, to get us started today, I'm going to do a very brief stage set. I have a fairly extensive background with cloud computing and cloud deployment, microservices, a whole range of issues. Transportation agencies today collect and manage a wealth of data information on traffic patterns, road quality, bridge maintenance, extreme weather, natural disasters, and much, much more, which helps planners ensure a safe and reliable transportation network. Managing that data has become an increasing challenge. Transportation leaders have to leverage automation and optimization tools to modernize their approach to information management. Cloud-based technologies help transportation organizations define, improve, and optimize their data infrastructure, enabling them to become more agile and efficient. Moving to the cloud helps transportation agencies leverage AI and machine learning capabilities, scale operations faster and more comprehensively, and maximize security through cloud-native cyber solutions. Today, our speakers will demonstrate how our own transportation organization can transform its data management by moving to the cloud. And with that, turn the time now to Doug Kudo. Doug, go ahead.
Thank you, Bob, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today. We're, as the CIO at the state of Michigan DOT, I was an early adopter of cloud solutions. One of our very earliest applications for a large transportation department was the installation of an electronic bidding system. And we actually started this in 2002, so that's a few years back, to handle contractor bids. In fact, I understand that system is still in use today, and they're processing billions and billions of dollars in bids every year. What we wanted to do was transition an old process from paper to an electronic environment. That old process was all the contractors would come to a hotel somewhere in the state. They'd meet with their subs during the night and then turn on all their paper bids by 9 o'clock in the morning. And then the transportation department would open them one at a time and read the amounts. Now, that worked in its day, but it also meant it took a lot of resources on both sides of the equation. So we decided to move to a cloud solution for electronic bidding. And it took about a year of working with the business units in the contractor community to kind of reach an understanding and garner support and acceptance for an electronic system, because this was considered a real crucial application for both the department as well as the contractor community. Just about the time we were to go live, there were two events that occurred in the same month. One is the Pentagon website was hacked, as well as AOL. Now, those hackers never got into their systems. None of the data was at risk or the application. It was the equivalent of running up to the front of the Pentagon and throwing a can of paint on the wall next to the front door. But that created some doubt. So in getting support from our Transportation Commission, which was our board of directors, so what I ended up doing was running a set of workshops with those policymakers to help them gain understanding about security features, and then hired a third-party auditor to verify the security features of the solution we were considering. I share that story with you because adoption of the cloud is not just a matter of turning a switch. It's like any other application that you would want to consider. You have to understand how it can be used by the business, and then you have to take the time to help the business and the users begin to use it. I used to find a lot of resistance when I talked about cloud, and one question I would always ask these decision makers is whether or not they did electronic banking, because that was getting rapid acceptance in the private sector, and many people had electronic bank accounts. Most of the time they would say yes, and then I would ask them if they trusted the system, and then shared with them that was a cloud application, because the banks didn't individually provide those services. So that was one way I kind of worked with our policymakers. Today, the cloud is used for handling large amounts of data, virtual infrastructure. This last year during the pandemic, I saw a good number of organizations, transportation and otherwise, move rapidly to virtual desktops so that they could support a workforce that was now working from home. I'm seeing clouds used for disaster recovery backup. I've always thought that was an important feature, particularly when you talk about resilience of our operations. Seeing cloud as a way to improve security. I never had enough FTE, so one way I tried to use a cloud was let the infrastructure be maintained by an external provider, and then that freed up the scarce FTE analysts to work with the business area so that they could get more value and use from an application. So that's kind of a high-level view from a CIO. Some of the areas I'm seeing emerging are things like e-ticketing, fare and toll collections on roads and bridges, mobility services as we look at alternate transportation methods, asset management systems, document management systems. We're collecting a lot of data with sensors and drones, and a lot of use of videos. There's nearly 70 million connected vehicles on our roads, and they're all providing data. Eventually, the DOTs will be wanting to collect more and more of that. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you, Bob.
Okay. Manali, go ahead.
Great, thank you for having me. Well, it is definitely an exciting time in transportation. I think with what we're seeing kind of coming with the new infrastructure bill, all the new challenges and opportunities the space is facing, it's really exciting to think about how we kind of transformation and investment, both on the physical infrastructure side and also on the digital infrastructure side. So you may be wondering kind of what's Google doing in this space and what is our role? And, maybe I'll just start off sharing, as you think about Google, our mission is really to help organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And when you think of the types of products and services that Google has from the consumer perspective, we think of things like search and assistant and things like that that really take all this kind of complex information on the back end and serve it up to us as consumers or users in a way that's intuitive and natural and easy to use. But behind the scenes, we're leveraging AI, machine learning, and cloud technologies to really power these applications that are, serving billions of users. So as we look at the world of transportation, a lot of the work that we've done in that space historically has been on the side of applications designed for travelers. So think of things like Google Maps, where we're interpreting the world around us, collecting all this data and across different modes of transportation about the physical world, and then we're providing those options to users in a way that is relevant and considers all the different options. And then we get into inside the vehicle, things like Android Auto, crowdsourced applications like Waze, and then of course that next generation of self-driving vehicles like Waymo, where those decisions are being automated. So there's lots of exciting things happening on the consumer side or the traveler side in terms of making it easier and safer for travelers. What we've been working on over the last several years is taking a lot of those technologies that we have used to build our own applications and making that much more accessible. And we call it democratizing AI. So it's taking all these tools, that we've used to build our own products and packaging them in a way where you don't have to have that in-depth knowledge and be a data scientist, but you can be a business user, you could be a developer, and it's accessible in easy to use ways. And that's the power of where we are with cloud technologies now. It's not just something that is for, the super technical folks. It's accessible to a much broader set of users. So as we've been working across the country and globally with departments of transportation, transit agencies, cities, states, there's a few different themes that we have been focused on and themes that are important to the agencies. The first big bucket is infrastructure planning and maintenance. And looking at really like what are the ways that we understand more about the assets, the road conditions, the signs, all the different assets that an agency has to manage, and understand where they are, what the conditions are, how to prioritize maintenance, and introduce some of that technology in there to make those processes easier. The second big bucket is traffic and safety analytics for operations. So this is really focused on more of that real-time and operational decision-making and understanding situational awareness, understanding and detecting patterns. So if we're looking at where do we really want to focus to make improvements in safety, being able to bring together lots of different data sets and uncover those patterns and surface things up both for real-time and planning decisions. And then the third area is equity and climate resilience. So we've heard a lot about this, coming in the new administration, and many agencies have been focused on bringing these lenses to the work that we're doing in transportation. And so we've been working on what we call an equity index to bring that understanding of what's the impact on different communities and communities that have been left behind. How does safety and crashes and the design of the infrastructure impact different communities? Transportation access, how does that vary by communities? And again, to help look at where do we focus investments and resources. In climate resilience, we're seeing all kinds of dynamics that agencies have been facing, and now the intensity and the frequency of these types of events is also intensifying. So being able to take large-scale Earth observation data that we have from Google Earth Engine and being able to translate those types of models to what's the impact on the infrastructure and how do we plan and understand what that impact is. These are some of the big themes, and definitely look forward to the conversation and diving more into them.
Thank you very much, Manali.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to wrap up with saying, in terms of some of the business drivers that we're seeing, there's a few different areas that we can dive into. Community engagement and having different ways of engaging different types of stakeholders and across different means, so that it's not all based on having a smartphone. What are other ways of engaging and getting those voices? The next is being able to do insight generation across larger scale sets of data and being able to get that insight much faster. We know transportation agencies have a lot of data already, and so really it's moving to having insights that can help make decisions faster. And then going along with that, reducing manual work. So being able to increase the efficiency, reduce that kind of lift of wrangling data or having all this manual work, so that the staff can really focus on the things where they can bring their expertise in terms of making decisions. And then the last area is prioritizing for impact. So being able to take a data-driven approach to looking at where to make those types of investments. And we've done this across a number of different agencies. So we've worked with agencies like the Colorado Department of Transportation on building out an advanced analytics platform to really help break down those data silos and be able to generate those types of insights and address lots of different use cases across traffic management, maintenance, operations, weather, lots of different areas, but building that foundation of a cloud-based analytics platform. We've also applied this technology to assets that already exist. Like, for example, with the city of Memphis, they have cameras on their public buses, and we helped develop machine learning models to detect conditions in the road and defects in the road and potholes and things like that, that then they could use to prioritize their maintenance efforts. So, just to give you a little bit of that flavor, it could be something where you're leveraging an existing asset and getting more insight out of it, or it could be an opportunity to rethink how overall you're approaching analytics to be able to deliver the insights faster. And with that, I will turn it back over.
Thanks so much, Manali. Daniel, take it away. It's all yours.
Daniel, I don't think we can hear you. You might be muted.
Okay, Daniel, you're still not coming through. We can certainly step through your slides
now
as you wish, or you can you might want to reboot and see if you can bring yourself back up again.
I'm hearing him now.
I'm still not getting anything through. Let's move forward, and then let's go ahead and pick Daniel up once we have a good, clear connection. And so we'll take a little break now, move to the panel discussion. And the panel discussion, our intent here is for everyone to participate. So to start this off, and again, as those of you in the audience, as you're listening, be sure and submit questions as you go, because we may incorporate some of them in our discussion. So Doug, let's start out with you. You talked about the advantages to DOTs and moving to a cloud versus premise-based environment. What are some of the key areas that need to be considered? And maybe most importantly, how do you get started?
Yeah, as we were preparing for this webinar, I gave some more thought. Early on, I would advise people to kind of take a look at your portfolio. And at the time I was starting, I had over 2,000 applications. So we needed to clear some of that stuff out. But at some point, you hit the lower priority applications. And that's where I originally would start to move things to the cloud to free up the staff time. But in today's world, from a security standpoint and a resilience standpoint, I might take some of the most critical applications, and if I didn't move them totally to the cloud, at least have a DR or failover emergency arrangement with a cloud provider. And one example I just happened to come across last week was a local government that had their data center in their city headquarters building, and there was an active shooter event, and the whole building became a crime scene. So they had no access to the data center while law enforcement did their investigation, which took multiple days. The CIO made the decision on day 2 to start moving more to the cloud for DR. And I thought, you know, given the number of issues we've had recently, the cyber attacks, things like an active shooter, severe weather events in places that we weren't seeing them in the past, that I think DR, it becomes a more critical issue.
Interesting observation. I know we both had a lot of experience in this area, and you mentioned 2,000 applications. That's a bunch. Lift and shift certainly is not a clean option in that kind of an environment. So how do you decide what to move first?
We had a set of we work with the business and had a set of priorities. So part of the reasons I had so many is we were at the time moving from mainframe to client server. And so in the mainframe environment, there are a lot of little applications for very specified functions. And over time, we would just shut those down. And most DOTs don't have that many applications anymore. But with that priority set, then you can make the decision of what's most critical, if that's your decision point, particularly from a resilience standpoint, I know one DOT had a ransomware attack and they lost all their operating systems. They had some systems that were in the cloud. They were not affected at all because the ransomware attack didn't have access to that environment. They were just a user of the application. So that, to me, today, resilience and security has to be part of that priority decision on where you start. So it's sitting down with the business and saying, what's most important? What do you need? Our traffic management systems are important, particularly during evacuations, during recovery activities. The pandemic has taught us that we can continue to operate more distributed than we have in the past. That takes you to a virtual infrastructure solution so that that's reliable in, from my military background, what we called as a hardened system.
Very helpful. Do any of the other speakers have comments on this same area? I'm curious to know, Google, how do you get started with somebody?
Yeah, I think as Doug mentioned, really starting with what are the outcomes? What are the decisions you're trying to make or the mission outcomes that are most important? And that's where we usually start. We say like, okay, what is the business outcome? So we don't start from the technology perspective, we start from the business outcome. Are there decisions that you're trying to make, or, is it security issues? Is it cost issues? Like, what are the motivating factors that are important in terms of outcomes? And then we start with that as the basis and then look at what's the right application of technology. And so a lot of the things that I mentioned in my opening remarks were focused around business outcomes or mission outcomes. And so it could be something like incident management, right? And being able to detect incidents faster. And so we look at what are the data sources, what are the things that we can combine and apply, AI and machine learning techniques to be able to understand and decipher like that pattern faster so that there can be, the operational teams can react faster to that. So it really starts with what's a decision or an outcome that the agency is seeking, and then we start from there. Maybe I'll turn it over to
Daniel, do you have any comment on this? Okay. Any other comments from any of the other speakers?
Let me pick up on something Manali said. In her opening comment, she talked about the large amounts of data. We see the data within the DOT increasing exponentially, particularly with the number of sensors that are being deployed to collect data, whether it's about where its equipment is located, whether it's bridge status. In Michigan, we have 5,000 bridges that we're keeping data about their condition. When you add the automated vehicle infrastructure, that is starting to generate large amounts of data. So being able to manage that data, store it, keep it safe, and then apply tools like Manali just mentioned, artificial intelligence, to be able to glean what the data is telling you, become really important from an operational standpoint.
Yeah, those are good points. So when we look at this whole issue of cloud versus premise, I continue to see, as I work with other states, ongoing arguments that, well, I'm really not comfortable in the cloud. I want to do this on-prem. Doug, what's your response on that? And I'd love to hear Google's response as well.
Well, you heard me talk about the electronic banking example. It's interesting to me that we get those comments, and yet we've got a whole generation that's doing everything electronically. I was talking to a merchant recently, and he shared with me he doesn't think this new generation would even know how to write a check because they're using electronic payment systems for everything they do. So I see that beginning to change over time. In the center in the Center for Digital Government surveys we do, I've watched over the last 5 years a steady increase of migration to cloud solutions. And I think I mentioned one jurisdiction, local government, is reporting they've actually moved 90% of all their applications to the cloud. So we're seeing cloud first becoming the strategy, but it's hard to argue the on-prem versus cloud from people who just haven't experienced it.
Any other comments from other speakers? Okay, let's move on to another discussion topic. So when we look at cloud technologies enabling DOT priorities and mission outcomes for DOTs and their customers, how does this really work? Monali, what are you seeing?
Yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, there's different starting points. And, some agencies, and every agency kind of has the difference, generally like similar sets of priorities, but based on their history, based on their location, based on their size, there's a different path to kind of figure out what's the right path for me as an agency. And there's some agencies we've seen, like I mentioned with Colorado DOT, where they really took an approach of starting from a foundation of building this analytics platform across lots of different use cases. And, they started with specific use cases, but with this bigger, bolder vision in mind that we want to break down those silos that exist often and have built up over the years, right? And so they took this approach of really bringing together all of these different sources of data into what we call like this real-time data hub, and then this advanced analytics platform for both the kind of real-time and operational use cases, and then some of the other use cases where we can build up data, apply modeling, and do some of this pattern detection, and really apply it at large scale across many different areas of the organization. And then we have other agencies who want to start with a very specific mission problem that they want to solve. And one of the examples, like with the Chicago Department of Transportation, they really wanted to focus on work zones and road closures and that type of work. And they had many different entities, different departments within the city. They had utilities, lots of different entities who needed to go and open up a stretch of road. It could be for maintenance work, it could be for laying conduit, for utilities work, and that work was not coordinated. And so we helped with a partner to build a platform that enabled that visibility across all of these different stakeholders to understand the projects and be able to coordinate so they're not going and opening up that same stretch of road a month later because there was a different need that came about. And then the second part of it was actually then communicating that information to the public and having communities understand what's the impact to their neighborhood and their communities. And so the power of, there's these different approaches, but the power is to be able to deploy these technologies quickly and be able to put it out there, use it, iterate on it. That whole process is so much easier because of the technology, right? And so it's, again, like the technology is not the end goal, but it enables that whole process of that rapid kind of iteration, get something out there, then improve upon it, learn from it, and it just becomes so much faster to be able to run through those cycles, to be able to solve different types of use cases.
Monali, one other question I've observed as I've worked with cloud deployments for the last 5 or 6 years is sometimes there's a gap between local knowledge and an understanding of the stack that, say, someone like Google offers. How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, the ability to make the technology easier to use is one of the things we don't want people to have to understand all the, kind of all the different technologies and all the different in-depth ways to use things. We want to make it easier to help solve their problems. And so the way that we approach it is we bring partners who have expertise in our engineering teams to help design what's the most effective way to reach the business outcome. And then in the tools themselves, there's one tool that we have that's called BigQuery, which is analytics, kind of data warehouse analytics and machine learning. You can do all that in one place. And so again, just making it easier that there's not so many different things you have to learn, but here's a place where you can ingest lots of different sources of data. You can have access to data that we host, publicly available data sets and other curated data sets from Google. And then you could bring that in, you could bring in your own data, you could start running machine learning models, you could visualize the data, like all of that happens in one place. So it becomes much more accessible and it doesn't require that like super in-depth knowledge of all the different technologies.
Very helpful. Daniel, a question for you on this same thing. As an architect, you've had to deal with these kinds of issues of people not understanding what they can do in the cloud. How do you communicate that? How do you bring them along?
Let's see if I can first bring myself along. Can y'all hear me now?
Yes, you're coming through.
Okay, wonderful. I apologize, everybody.
We'll bring you back to your presentation momentarily.
Oh, don't worry about it. This has been a great conversation. Everyone's been getting some great insights. So let's just roll with it. The conversation's more fun anyway. But just like that, having conversations with folks and being able to understand that there's a lot of buzzwords in it from data lake or even hearing BigQuery for the first time. So there is a kind of a ramp up in education. So as an architect, some of our roles vary. We have to wear different hats. Sometimes we have very technical hats. Sometimes we have to wear a teacher's hat and be able to explain to the team and be able to come alongside them. With the different departments that we've worked with, there's all different stages of readiness. They have different backgrounds, different technical sets. Some of them only know how to do Python, or some of them only know how to do SQL. So we do inventory where their strengths are, and then try to rally some of those solutions. And sometimes the solution is education and onboarding them to a greater understanding of the technology and how to leverage it. Sometimes they have to think about it differently. Manali was talking about with BigQuery. Sometimes it's really hard for people to grasp the power and the size of data that you can query with BigQuery. So sometimes we just have to show them, taking some of their existing data sets or some of their existing queries that they've done in the past. Things that may take them, ballpark low end, maybe hours in order to compute. Sometimes they would take it overnight. Sometimes they would take days in order to get some of those insights and some of those aggregates done. And then the first time we show them that they can get done in a matter of seconds, it's kind of mind-blowing. And it really does change the dynamics of how they think about bringing their use cases to the cloud. Sorry for dominating that. I probably had a lot. I was trying to get caught up, but I'll hand it back over to you, Doug.
No, that's very helpful.
Bob, sorry.
So thinking about this then, I see data scientists doing some remarkable things with data. We get to where we can accumulate data in data lakes. We break data sets up so we can do better analysis. What if an agency still doesn't have a clear idea how this all comes together to get a more holistic view? For all three of you, how do you deal with that? It's one thing to have data, and states have tons of it, but how do you get it to where they can see the relationships and really understand what's going on? Don't all jump in at once. I know that's a hard question, but I'd like to hear your answer. Doug, what's your thought on it?
Well, I'm seeing a move to more rigorous data management programs. My title in the Air Force was Director of Information Management. That later evolved into the CIO world. But even back then, we were concerned about the large amounts of data that we were processing, because I happened to be assigned to an intelligence agency, and our mission was collecting and processing data globally. So I took that into the transportation world. And one of the early things I did is created a team of business owners. And as we looked at our applications, we then looked at the associated data source for those applications. And we designated data owners. And by that, that was the person who could make changes to the data and would validate that it was the trusted source. And that's a rigorous process. But when you get that team in place, you develop experts around the kinds of data that the business is generating and how it's being used. And then you can get rid of the ancillary data sources and begin to point everything back to that trusted source. So at the state and local government levels, we're also seeing that data scientists, chief data officers positions are being created to manage these data teams.
Very helpful. Manali and Daniel, what are your comments?
I don't mind jumping in there. You use the idea about like certified data. Like, can you trust it, and is it the most valuable? I don't know about you all, but sometimes we have to get buy-in, and I'll try to say that all of my slides had number one for the bullet point, so everything was number one. We all want everything now. Kind of reminds me of a Queen song. But we want to be able to focus on the things that can get that buy-in, and sometimes that's a political move. And being able to have access to certified data, certified meaning it is the most accurate. We don't want to be making decisions on a month-old data. We want to make sure that we have the right situational awareness of the roadways, whether that's with weather or we're getting road conditions or friction off of the roads from a connected vehicle. We want to map all that back. And so, having the buy-in and say, you're going to give me access to your data, and in exchange, I'm going to give you access to all these other departments' information. I think that's really helpful. And I don't mean necessarily to harp on, we have limited resources. And so I understand that some of these different department directors, they need to try to get the best bang for their buck, and they want to get as much out of it as they can. So sometimes kind of dangling that carrot of having the most accurate information out there, so that way then you can come back and do the things like the analysis and being able to do maybe secondary crash analysis. Maybe you need to make sure that you have a response time to get the vehicles cleared off of your roadway within so many minutes of an incident to make sure that you don't have another incident. So I think that having some of those talking points and us helping equip you with those sound bites and knowing what kinds of items can resonate with those different departments where we've had some pushback, I think that's helpful. So sorry if I take it off to a different direction. I'm still playing catch up here.
No problem at all. Manali, any comment on this before we move along?
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think on the data side, we start with, what's the data that exists, and then can it answer the questions? And if it can, great. And often we can find ways to, do that large scale kind of insight generation that helps answer those questions. But we can also look at what are the new sources of data that could be brought in to help solve those questions in a way that maybe are non-traditional. So it could be things like taking cameras, right, where it's an unstructured data source, but we develop models and we extract insights that is turned into structured data that you can use to make you get more insight to be able to make a decision related to traffic management or safety. It could be things like bringing in Waze data. It could be that's incidents and speed information, crowdsourced data. That could be another source of data. It could be things like using Google search trends data to look at, where are people going? What are the things, the places that they're searching for? It could be sentiment analytics. So there's so many different ways to look at, the data sources, but we start with what's there and look at what do we need to complement the existing data sources to ultimately get to the decisions or the insights that are being sought.
Before we transition to Daniel, and Daniel, I'll think about this a moment. You can either do your presentation or I can ask you questions. But one comment I would make on this, with the most interesting thing for me is talking to leaders of agencies and finding out what kinds of information would you really like to have, and then figure out where the data is located. I have yet to be in a situation where the data was all located in the agency, ever. I think that's instructive all by itself. So Daniel, let's turn the time to you. If you want to go to your presentation, you're welcome to. If you'd like to just start off with some questions, we can do that. What would you prefer? Losing you, Daniel.
I unmuted the screen when I should have unmuted my phone. I apologize.
Not a problem.
No, I think you're doing a fantastic job with the conversation here, and the wisdom that our audience is able to receive, whether they're watching it here live or they're going through the replay. I think it's really valuable. Being able to hear some of the, we all have scar tissue. Like, it doesn't always go as smoothly as possible as we want it to go through. And so being able to have a conversation, I think, is really valuable. And you talked about not having all of the data right where you want it. I have seen a similar situation where the data was there, it was just duplicated. Like, all these different departments, they needed other data to complement or to enrich something in order for them to be able to have the insight. And then you've got 6 different departments all doing the same thing in the dark. So one of the things that we've seen being able to do that is when you do centralize this information and you do get that buy-in from the departments by giving them good patterns and giving them maybe even code examples and making it easy for them to get into the system, is to then start working towards a data catalog. That means different things in different areas. The simple explanation of data catalog is that it gives you a way to shop and find the data that you're looking for under the terms and conditions that you're needing it, making sure that it's actually being refreshed at the rate that you're wanting, having all that available so you don't go back and say, oh, let's go and try to bring in data from some third-party weather services, when that same information may be already available from some other source. Yes, we need to have those ideas. I'm going to bring another big term as you develop your data lake. Data lakes are for unstructured data. And I would say that the data lake is for those folks. Think of it as this way. We're always trying to find that signal to noise ratio. What often happens is when you start curating some of this data and trying to answer very specific questions, you inevitably have to transform that data and you lose some of the precision. The data lake allows us to be able to capture all that information, even if right now we think some of that information is noise. But as soon as we start to try to find out, well, how much noise and when that noise is happening is signal. That's information. Like, if you want to know, like, you may eventually want to be able to eliminate some duplicate messages. Maybe you have some sort of roadway sensor that's acting up, and it's giving you double or 3 times or 10 times the number of messages that you really are wanting. And so you try to go through. But what if that information later on is signal that says, oh, we could have predicted that we need to service this sooner, so that way we didn't have an outage for whatever that sensor was providing that information. That's where I think it's really helpful to be able to help educate, kind of coordinate the different, get the buy-in, understanding how those different tools come together, having a great partner like CloudReach and Google, being able to help bring those goals together.
One of the interesting things I've noticed about working with partners like Google and CloudReach and others is the issue of time to benefit. When a DOT or another large agency tries to roll it all on their own, time is not their friend. How do you help them make that really work to where they get the benefit quicker? I'd like to hear from both of you if we could. Go ahead, Daniel.
I'll jump in on that one. On ours, the time to benefit, as you said, is sped up because most of the time departments can't just go and say, let me bring on qualified people who have the background and education to know how to handle the complexity of the tasks at hand. CloudReach helps to augment that staff. We kind of come in and be part of it. We provide those services through a long-term support contract. We have those ability to, like I said, do kind of like a staff augmentation for the time period that you need, so it's very budget friendly. So it does help you to get those benefits quicker. And while you have your staff being augmented with our skilled technicians and architects, you're upskilling at the same time. We're bringing you along with the journey. So that way you can take on the ownership and the maintenance of these things out in the future. Then we can be redirected as sources to whatever the next big piece or next technical hurdle is. That's how we try to partner with our different DOTs and our government entities.
Manali, what's the Google perspective on this?
Yeah, I love what Daniel was saying about working alongside with the agency and building the skills. And I think that's such an important part of it. It's like, initially, I think it's helpful to bring in resources to help get there faster. But at the same time, the goal is to build the capabilities within the workforce as well. And so that kind of collaborative approach where we're working with an agency to define what are the outcomes that are important, and then we're bringing the technical resources and the design resources that could bring that kind of speed to the outcomes, but at the same time, building the skills within the organization to be able to then operate and take that forward, I think is such an important aspect. I don't think just one way or the other is as effective, right? It doesn't help to just say, hey, go away and build something for me and come back, because you really have to understand the organization, the culture, the technology, all these aspects. But then sometimes trying to do it for an agency, if they're just trying to do it on their own, it's challenging because they're often short-staffed and have to focus on more of the business line needs. And so I think that combination of working together really helps accelerate. And so we could think about it, it's like we're doing things in weeks, not in years, in terms of the way that we approach it as Google.
Very helpful. So one of the things that's coming up, and this is go ahead.
From a CIO perspective, there's another issue that's emerging recently, and that's the challenge in hiring the right technical skills, whether it's data and network programmers. There's a shortage nationally of those skills. And I'm aware of a couple of DOTs, when I talked to their directors, and they were trying to start data programs. The data leads, the chief data officer positions, their candidates were expecting almost twice the salary of the director, and that just wouldn't fit any civil service system in any of our states. So what Daniel and Manelli are talking about, I think there's real important. Hiring the expertise that exists in their organizations, and then being able to build and grow internal capacity in parallel to that, because they're not going to recruit the skills and set up a program.
I can certainly testify to that, having experienced it, and I think you're totally correct. So as we move into some Q&A, let's pick up a couple of things that really seem to be pretty natural. So Daniel, what kind of practical use cases exist out there? Is this stuff real?
Can you rephrase your question for me? It popped out just a little bit. Say it one more time,
okay.
Please.
What kind of practical use cases exist out there for these kinds of migrations and changes? I mean, is this real?
It is. I've already heard a couple people mention about connected vehicles. One of the use cases that I say is a very real one is how incredibly real time that is. As a vehicle is moving down, of course, you have your traditional fleet management use case where the vehicle, you want to know where it is. Some of the places you have to worry about snow. I don't have to worry about snow here in Alabama. We don't have snow plows that we have to go and clear. We have other issues, but some of those departments do need to know where those snow plows are and be able to coordinate and making sure that they're not trying to route emergency traffic in the same pass, make sure that the roads are clear. But they're also having other connected vehicles that are reporting much more maybe benign information. We talked about looking at the buses that have photos taking place, looking at the road conditions, seeing like potholes, recognizing other things like that. We've got some use cases coming up right now where we have 2 transfer appliances going to be filled to the brim to bring all that imagery onto Google Cloud and storage, doing some analysis and doing some initial metadata parsing off of that to be able to see what kinds of insights we could have on top of the existing use cases where they want to be able to analyze and be able to see certain conditions off of the road. Some other, with regard to variable speed limits, we've got all kinds of different conditions that can change. Like, we want to maximize the throughput because we don't want to hinder the products that are going across those roadways. We want to get them to the locations. As we saw in COVID, we don't want to hinder people getting the food that they want to have, and people will have some panic. So we want to get as much across those roadways as we can without compromising the safety of those passengers. So being able to figure out that right and that optimal speed limit to set for a particular corridor is critical. And sometimes knowing what the wind condition is, knowing what the friction is on the roadways, having all that information coming through and having a platform that knows how to parse, later analyze, turn those, that analysis insight into predictive measures and be able to say, okay, for this corridor, this is the best way to get the most vehicles safely from point A to point Z. Those are some of the use cases that we're seeing real right now.
Very, very helpful. We have time for probably one final question that I'd like to get several responses on. And this comes back to the issue of, okay, if a DOT wants to do this, how do they get started and who needs to be at the table from a planning perspective? Doug, do you want to take that? Well, I'd like to hear from each one of you if we could. It's a fairly important issue.
Well, I would start with the CIO, the director of technology. They exist in some form in the DOT. Many of the states have centralized their IT organization, so there may be a different title within the DOT that's responsible for data. But I think you want to find that person. I would also encourage people to do a little bit of research about some of the programs that are out there. There's some material at the center that they can look at and begin to understand where to start. I helped a group put together a guide on how to create a program a couple of years ago, and that's available at the Transportation Research Board. So there's a fair amount of material out there that can help people get started. There's some state DOTs that are excellent in the programs they've created. So there's some peer discussion places that they can go to get started. And then I'd call Manali and Daniel.
With that in mind, let's get a brief response from Manali and Daniel on that same question. Go ahead, Manali.
Yeah, what I've seen to work really well is when you have somebody like the technology side, but then you also have somebody from the business and the mission side, and then those who are going to be the users. If you can get that combination of people together, then you're solving for the technology, but then making sure that what's being delivered is meaningful and useful to the business users who are going to be leveraging the outcomes from the technology. And so if that group of people can come together in the beginning and define what success looks like, that is what I would recommend. That works really well.
Okay, Daniel, you have the final comment.
I would first say for getting in contact with us, that would be gcp@cloudreach.com, and we can help get the right people to the table. Totally agree with everyone who has said there. Having the right mix of those you have to balance the budget, you have to have the use cases, you have to have the technical insight. So depending on the use cases in which you find, if it's a green field, that's helpful. If you're trying to do some migrations, then having some folks have that scar tissue from what pieces of the data are current and valid that need to be brought over, they would be brought in at the different times. So that way we can have the right scope, the right timeline. But again, GCP at cloudreach.com, and we'll get you connected with the right people.
Thanks so much. Well, I want to be respectful of our 1 hour commitment, so we'll have to wrap it up here. In closing, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us for today's event. And a big thank you needs to go to my fellow speakers, Doug, Manali, and Daniel, and a special thanks to our partners at CloudReach for enabling us to bring this worthwhile discussion to our audience. Thanks once again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at another government technology event.